Greetings, everyone. I am Dr. Pallavi Priya, and today we are going to be talking about metabolic syndrome and obesity associated illnesses. So, let's start with the presentation. I have been given the task of talking about obesity associated diseases and metabolic syndrome. This is me. And when we talk about obesity associated diseases, they are not necessarily always metabolic syndrome. Therefore, I have taken the liberty to divide the talk into two broad parts: obesity associated diseases and metabolic syndrome. Because when we talk about these illnesses, these can be diseases of mechanical stress and these can be metabolic syndrome per se. Why do we need to talk about these differently? Because metabolic syndrome as a whole carries a whole gamut of diseases that come from a single pathophysiology. Meanwhile, the diseases of mechanical stress can be diseases like osteoarthritis, sleep apnea, venous stasis diseases. However, now it is known that even all of these diseases like arthritis and sleep apnea as well have a small component of inflammation as well. I wouldn't even say small, have a rather significant component of inflammation. Now, coming to metabolic syndrome, why do we need to talk about metabolic syndrome and what is metabolic syndrome? So, a metabolic syndrome is basically a group of risk factors that increases the likelihood of us or any person developing problems like heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes. And how do we define metabolic syndrome? Well, there are certain criteria, and three out of these five criteria are met, then the person is supposed to be at a risk of metabolic syndrome or the person is supposed to have metabolic dysfunction. Now, these criteria are not consistent. There are at least six different societies who have published different criteria for metabolic syndrome, and all of them may have different cutoffs and X out of Y criteria separately. In addition to that, metabolic dysfunction is a little difficult to define in children because while studying it, it is not possible for us, or rather difficult for us, to get the metabolic endpoint of cardiovascular diseases, which are common in adults. So, why do we need to talk about metabolic syndrome? Let's see an oral glucose tolerance test done on non diabetic volunteers between 1970 and 2014. As you can see, there is not much difference. The glucose level in the beginning, in the end, stays pretty much the same. There is a little bit of difference 20-30 minutes after taking the glucose, but does not amount to much. However, look at this. The insulin needed to maintain the same level of glucose is increased approximately 4 to 5 times from 1970, which is the line in blue, to 2014, which is the line in purple. And insulin resistance or diabetes is the sentinel event for metabolic syndrome. Therefore, this gives us a pretty good idea of how metabolically unhealthy we are. To achieve the same level of glucose, our bodies need to produce 4 to 5 times more insulin. And most of the times when we talk about this, we say, okay, approximately 30% of the population is obese, and approximately 80% of that population has metabolic dysfunction. So if this is the population we target, we ask them to eat less, more. The problem should get better. I'm going to put some numbers here. Stay with me. We'll all circle back to the problem. In 2001, there was a paper published in Nature which said between 2001 to 2010, the number of diabetics will increase from 151 million to 221 million, which kind of turns into a annualized inflation rate of 3.6%. However, when 2010 actually came, that number was not 221 million, it was 285 million. making it an actual inflation rate of 6.5%. And what happened after 2010? Between 2010 and 14, it increased at a rate of 10%. So, what's happening is we are trying to fix the problem, but the problem is not reducing. It's not even staying the same. The problem is actually increasing. And why is that happening? Because we probably don't understand the problem. And this is why, yes, 30% of the population is obese, and these people are at a higher risk of developing metabolic dysfunction. But at the same time, 70% of the normal weight population, 40% of those people also have metabolic dysfunction. So, this burden of metabolic dysfunction is actually higher than the burden in obesity. Obesity does increase the chances of developing metabolic dysfunction by approximately 3 times, but it doesn't mean that a sizable population who has a normal weight does not develop metabolic dysfunction. In fact, that number in absolute numbers is actually a bigger number. And we see the same thing if we look at this graph. This is a graph that plots countries according to their diabetes prevalence and obesity prevalence. Is there a correlation? Yes, there is a correlation, but correlation is not causation. We all know this from the basic statistics because we see some countries here which have high obesity, but diabetes stays down. However, there are certain countries here like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Obesity isn't as much, but diabetes is as high as 7%, 8%, or 10% of general population. So, what does that mean? There is something else going on. And also, obesity is increasing worldwide at 2.7% every year. At the same time, diabetes is increasing at 1.5 times that rate. What is happening here? And this is the answer. We are not looking at the inclusive picture of metabolic dysfunction. Metabolic dysfunction is not a function of obesity. Obesity is a risk factor for metabolic dysfunction. It's not the reason for metabolic dysfunction. Metabolic syndrome is a problem of excess nutrients, cellular stress, and there is a central role of fat cells or adipose tissue that needs to be discussed. For that, we'll go to the whiteboard. We will talk a little bit about inflammation. We'll talk about adipose tissue or fat cell and their dysfunction, and we'll talk about different types of fat cells. We will talk about what is metabolic toxins and oxidative stress, and we will talk about the role of liver in all of this, and then we'll try to put this all together. At first, coming to the topic of inflammation. It was as early as 1901 when we saw that high doses of anti-inflammatory like salicylic acid cured diabetes mellitus. Sometime later in 1993, it was proven that an inflammatory mediator called TNF alpha, it also was responsible for insulin resistance, and it was only one of the inflammatory mediators. And when we blocked the receptors of TNF alpha, it actually cured the diabetes in obese mice. So we found out that there is some role of inflammation in developing diabetes, which is the sentinel event for metabolic syndrome, or rather insulin resistance. Now, coming to adipose tissue or fat cells. What do fat cells have to do with metabolic dysfunction? Well, let's see. Here is a fat cell, small and happy. What it does as excess nutrients come in, it stores the excess nutrients, whether it is glucose, whether it is fat. Glucose is converted into fat and then it is in turn stored into these adipose tissue. And then it undergoes something called as hypertrophy. This tissue becomes bigger. And as it becomes bigger, it also needs supply from the outside. It needs oxygen, it needs nutrients to survive, which actually percolate into the cell from the surrounding through diffusion. Now it is bigger. The diffusion has to work harder, but it still works. However, what happens when this nutrient excess persists, when this becomes chronic? This fat cell becomes too big. And when this becomes a little too big, stay with me. We'll try to make this as simple as possible, but not simpler because we are talking about a complex issue. The diffusion of the nutrients can happen up to a certain level, but there is a central zone of reduced nutrient perfusion, reduced oxygen perfusion, central zone of hypoxia. Because of that, this area undergoes necrosis and the fat cell starts dysfunctioning. The central area undergoes fibrosis and the fat cells, the entire tissue, adipose tissue, starts undergoing functions like fibrosis, and the lipid storage capacity here becomes limited. Now, coming to metabolic toxins. Let's go back to the drawing board. It's a cell. It gets nutrients. It utilizes the nutrients and it produces certain metabolites out of those nutrients. Now, it's just like us. We eat, we poop, we pee. However, we do not live with that poop and pee because it's bad for our body. So, while our cells have a certain capacity to deal with these metabolites, this is not an infinite capacity. As we increase the nutrition more and more and more, the cells are practically drowning in its own poop. The metabolites that the cell produces is actually toxic to the environment of the cell, or rather, most of them are toxic to the environment of the cell. Therefore, sometimes they cause cellular dysfunction. That means the cells don't work as well. Sometimes they cause inflammation. Certain metabolites are more inflammatory than the other metabolites. And that is where the concept of this inflammatory food comes in. Some food is more inflammatory than the others because the metabolic product of certain food is more inflammatory than the other. And also, it leads to the generation of something called as reactive oxygen species. We frequently talk about oxidation and we talk about antioxidants. Oxygen is good for us. We do need oxidation in our body to digest our food and for other bodily functions. However, this is a very fine double-edged sword. It needs to be balanced very delicately. Too much of reactive oxygen species, which cause oxidation, is not good for us. It actually starts killing our own cells or at least damaging them. Therefore, chronic nutrient excess or wrong type of nutrients cause reactive oxygen species. Coming down to different types of adipose tissue. Again, not all fat is bad. We have something called as subcutaneous adipose tissue, that is the fat cells under our skin. And then we have visceral adipose tissue, the fat inside our abdomen, the fat around our organs. And it is the visceral adipose tissue which is metabolically active. It actually works a little more than subcutaneous adipose tissue. And because this visceral adipose tissue is in direct contact with the liver actually becomes the first organ to get affected because of these metabolites, because it's the function of liver to get all these excess metabolites and provide antioxidants in the form of glutathione to neutralize these reactive oxygen species and the other toxic metabolites which enter the liver, damage the cells of the liver. Again, keep in mind that this is a very simplistic picture of what we need to talk about. However, we'll keep it at this, and I would urge you to go and read a little more about it. Going back to our presentation and putting it all together, what happens here? We eat excess calories. Our fat cells, or which is called the adipose tissue, they undergo hypertrophy, they undergo oxidative stress, they inflame, and then there is an overflow of metabolites. And from there, everything goes to the liver, causing dysfunction in liver, which is non alcoholic fatty liver disease, or fatty liver as we call it, inflammation. And again, all of these toxic metabolites can cause insulin resistance by their own. The same metabolites go to peripheral tissues as well, and there they cause similar kind of a reaction: inflammation, oxidative stress, peripheral insulin resistance. When there is an excess of nutrients or the wrong kind of food, it starts changing the microbiota of our gut. And this in turn changes the signals that our food produces and how all of this afferent goes to the central nervous system. Our central nervous system receives input from the metabolites, the food that we eat, and hormones from our gut and everywhere else in the body. I'll stop for a second there and spend a minute here. Long chain fatty acids go to our central nervous system, interact with the neurons, and they decrease the insulin resistance. However, chronic stimulation with long chain fatty acid actually exhausts the neurons and they stop working. So, if there is excess of long chain fatty acids in the diet, it increases insulin resistance. However, polyunsaturated fatty acids do not have the same effect on the nervous system. They do not exhaust the neurons, and therefore, they are supposed to be better than long chain fatty acids when it comes to fat intake. So, coming down and again putting it all in one place, because of all this metabolic stress, what happens in the body? The blood pressure increases, there is increased risk of cancer, there is increased risk of heart disease, insulin resistance increases, and it goes to develop type 2 diabetes. We talked about NAFLD or fatty liver diseases. We talked about PCOS. When this excess toxic metabolite goes to the reproductive system, it causes problems like PCOD or gonadal dysfunction. And I'll spend some time on the diet here as I see some nutritionists here in the audience. What do you think is common between all of these food items here that you see on the stage? It's the Browning reaction or Maillard reaction, also called as non-enzymatic glycosylation. So all of us are cooking ourselves. We are not roasting for 1 hour at 375 degrees, but we are slow cooking ourselves at 98.6 degrees for 75 years. And it causes a Browning reaction. You don't believe me? If you look at the costal cartilage of a newborn, this is how it looks. And at the age of 80, this is how it looks. There is a Browning reaction going on at all points in our body. A very busy slide. Don't look at the entire point of it. But remember, we talked about the oxidative stress, which causes aging, which causes metabolic dysfunction. Increased sugars, fructose at least 8 times more than glucose, but increased sugars in all form when it is metabolized cause generation of reactive oxygen species, which causes damage of DNA, which causes cellular dysfunction and death, and it hastens your Browning reaction. It makes your Browning faster. And each of these processes that we talk about, it potentiates the other process, promoting a complete vicious cycle, making the syndrome worse and worse. So it's very difficult to stop this. uh, the things have become so bad that a disease that did not even exist, the non alcoholic liver disease or the fatty liver disease that we call in the regular vernacular, it's the leading cause of liver transplant in US now. So this disease didn't even exist a couple of decades ago. And there are certain inconvenient truths that we need to handle. There is no medicalized prevention for chronic metabolic diseases. There is only symptomatic treatments. The prevention comes from the diet. You cannot fix healthcare until you fix the health. And as far as metabolic diseases are concerned, we cannot fix health until we fix the diet. And we cannot fix diet until we know what is actually wrong with the diet. And with this, I end my lecture here. When it comes to metabolic diseases, it's the lifestyle, that's everything. And that is what needs to be addressed. Thank you very much.